livestock, crawling things, and wildlife. And that's what happened. God made every kind of wildlife, every kind of livestock, and every kind of creature that crawls on the ground. God saw how good it was. And God said, "Let us make humanity in our image to resemble us, so that they may take charge of the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the livestock, all the earth, and all the crawling things on the earth." So God created humanity in God's own image. In the divine image, God created them. Male and female, God created them. This is holy wisdom, holy word. Let us pray. God, we do thank you for holy wisdom and holy word. We thank you for breathing in us, speaking to us, speaking through us this day. God, I ask that you would bless the words that I will speak. I pray that you would speak through me, and I pray that you would speak in spite of me. That the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts would be acceptable to you. Amen. So we continue today in our sermon series called "The Bible is Queer and Genderful." This is the second of our sermons, and today we're going to shift a little bit from talking about sexual orientation to focusing on gender and gender identity in the Bible. So last week we talked a little bit about sexual orientation, and this week we're going to focus on gender identity. Gender identity is different from sexual orientation, and it's important that we understand that. So I want to kind of put us all on the same page, because we're in different places, and I want to make sure we're kind of on the same page. Sexual orientation is about who you are sexually and romantically attracted to. So it's about your relationship to others, your relationship to others. Everyone has a sexual orientation. So being gay, lesbian, bisexual, heterosexual, or any other sexuality has to do with your relationship to others. Your gender identity is how you see yourself. It's about your internal sense of being male, female, neither, or both. We all have gender identity. And we all make choices about how we express our gender identity, choices about whether we cut our hair or how we cut our hair on the head, whether we cut the hair on our legs and our armpits, the clothes we wear, the body parts we reveal, and so on and so forth. We all make choices about how we reveal our gender identity or express our gender identity. So you see how these two things can intersect, but they are different. So you can be, for example, a transgender woman who's attracted to men, which would mean you are transgender and straight. Or you can be a cisgender man attracted to men, and that would make you cisgender and gay. Important to know that people don't always feel that they fit into any of these categories. So it's always important that we talk about and refer to people the way they want to be identified. And language around gender identity and sexuality is always changing and evolving, so it's an ongoing thing. But I wanted to make sure we were on the same page, that those two things are different, even though they do intersect. So recently, I learned about a type of fish called the bluehead wrasse. Has anyone ever heard? It's different from the pow-pow fish. This is a bluehead wrasse. It is a fascinating fish that scientists explain have 3 distinct sexes. The young bluehead wrasse in their very early stages of life are essentially sexless, but then as they mature, about 1/3 of the fish become female, another third become male, and then the last third don't fit either of these categories. The last third, after their sexless state, mature into a female fish that bears eggs. And then the female fish change gametes and become male, producing sperm. And in the final stage, they turn this brilliant blue color and they grow larger than any of the unchanged males. I was really fascinated by learning about this fish. When the smaller unchanged males are living in patches of seagrass, they can hide better, and so they tend to fertilize more eggs in those environments. But when living in the midst of a coral reef where all the fish are out in the open, the changed males win over and kind of overpower the unchanged males, and they win over the ability to father their own children. And scientists are saying that this diversity in sex among the bluehead wracks means that they can live in so many different kinds of environments and thrive wherever they live. How fascinating. Do you think that God might rejoice in something so beautiful, so creative, so diverse, and brilliant in color as the bluehead wracks? Do you? Yes. Any of us who believe in God, I think, would say, how amazing. God must be delighted. Now, I know that humans are not fish, and humans certainly do not have the capability to produce gametes and change their bodies like these fish do. But why is it that, especially in the Western world, we've struggled to imagine, much less rejoice or celebrate, such a thing as a human being not fitting into the gender binary system of being either male or female? We seem to be okay with fish not fitting into the binary system. We're not so sure about people. And the reasons for this are many, and we will touch on some of these reasons throughout the sermon series because it is important for those of us who identify as Christians that we continue to work on our internalized homophobia and transphobia. And we need to dig deep to think about where those fears come from. Why do we have them? And can we bring them into our conscious minds so that we can work on dismantling them? Because homophobia and transphobia come from somewhere. I don't believe they come from God. Perhaps a good place to start when thinking about human beings that don't conform to the binary system is to remember that there are cultures, non-Western cultures primarily, where a third gender or multiple genders are recognized. For example, the Two-Spirit people in Native American tribes, or the Fa'afafine of Samoa and Polynesia. The Hydra of India, they have recognized a third gender since antiquity. Or the Sokrata of Madagascar, which is an island off of East Africa. Or the Muxes of the Zapotec cultures in Oaxaca, Mexico. These cultures, many of them since antiquity, recognize more than two genders. And often people in these additional gender categories are highly esteemed and even considered spiritually authoritative in those cultures. So it's important for us to be aware that the presence of the third gender, beyond just male or female, has been in existence in cultures since antiquity. And this includes the time during which the Hebrew scriptures were written. There are, for example, Mesopotamian texts written as early as 1600 BCE that reference humans created with sex organs not immediately identifiable as male or female. And in the Mishnah and the Talmud, which is a Jewish compilation of oral law written between 200 and 500 CE, there are people referenced there who do not fit the male and female categories in Jewish culture. But since many of us in this room have grown up culturally influenced by our white Western context, the gender binary system is all we know, or at least grew up knowing. And let me just clarify, by gender binary system, I mean the social system in which it is assumed that people come only in two genders. So I grew up thinking that. It's the only system I grew up knowing about, just as I grew up thinking that heterosexuality was the only option and the norm. But the gender binary system is not the norm in all cultures. And it is the norm in white Western cultures. So it is important to understand this. And though we would not say that people were transgender or cisgender in the Bible, because that would be anachronistic, since the way we understand identity today did not exist in biblical times. But for our purposes, it's important to know that in the ancient world and in the Bible, we do have references of people, stories of people who did not conform to gender norms and the gender norms of their time, and people who lived lives in gender roles that did not match their assigned sex at birth. So we're going to be exploring some of these stories in the weeks to come. But this morning we're starting with Genesis 1. Perhaps you fell asleep during the reading because it's kind of long. But we're looking at Genesis 1, and I want to take a moment to lift up the voices of transgender folks who have helped me, and I hope will help us to approach Genesis 1. Because it's such an important text for Jews and for Christians. It's a very formative text for us. And I have learned a lot from a theologian called Austin Harkey, who I've quoted several times in the past few weeks. But he is a transgender Christian theologian and writer. He reflects on Genesis 1 by sharing about how, just like all of us, likely, he grew up within a social system where the gender binary was the norm. And at first glance, it seemed to him like Genesis 1 is all about those binaries. I mean, even in the reading, you could probably hear it, how God separated and broke everything up into pairs and opposites. Light is separated from the darkness, water is separated from the dry land, earth below separated from the sky above. And then, not surprisingly, that pattern continues with humans. God creates male and female. But as Harkey grew older, he says he began to understand that biologically, the world isn't separated distinctly into land or sea. What about marshes or estuaries or coral reefs, he asks. What about fish like the bluehead wrasse? And what he came to discover is that the writer of Genesis 1 is using a poetic device. And in this poetic device, though humans are broken up into two categories, Harkey says that verse does not discredit other sexes or genders any more than the verse about the separation of day and night rejects the existence of dawn and dusk, or the separation of land from sea rejects the existence of marshes or estuaries. Harkey says these binaries are not meant to speak of all reality. Of course not. Rather, these verses invite us into thinking about everything between and beyond. This expansion in our understanding of the world actually opens up the door to a new reverence for God's creation. Think of it this way. Could it be that by enforcing a binary system, forcing people to have to fit into one of two categories, that by doing that we are actually scorning God's creation? That we are actually putting ourselves in a position of knowing more than God, because we try to fit people into categories and into a system that God did not intend. Genesis 1 functions like poetry. And poetry, of course, is what humans for so long have used as a vehicle to try to put words to things that we struggle to describe. Who among us can even imagine, much less describe, how God created the world? Poetry seems to be the appropriate genre for doing that. And what I find so powerful and moving is that queer and trans folks are helping to move Christians back to a more faithful reading of Genesis 1. Because Genesis 1, as many of us know, has been used against queer and trans folks, saying, look, it's plain and simple. God made it this way, male and female, there's nothing in between or beyond, period, done, male, female only. And what queer and trans folks are saying is that this is actually a misuse of what this sacred scripture is about. The text wants to do something to us. It wants to instill in us an awe of God and all that God has made. And to see how God, even in God's self, rejoices in all the goodness of it all. Every living thing, every kind, every color, everything between the earth and sky, God is declared good. This text was never meant to be used as a tool to push people into a binary system. When we do that, we are inhibiting people from living into the image of God. Furthermore, if we ponder the way that God is referred to in the text, we will see that God's own identity resists the binary system. Have you noticed that the image of God in this text is an image of God as a communal God, a plural God? God says, let us make humankind in our image. We and trans folks are reminding us that God is beyond gender. God is omnigender. God is genderful. And on Trinity Sunday, just a few weeks ago, we talked about how queer and trans folks are pointing to the Trinity in Christian tradition and helping us to see how the Scriptures witness to a God who troubles the binaries in their very nature as God. God is always resisting boxes that we put God in. That is actually a theme throughout the whole Scriptures. God does not want to be in a box. If you notice, just I want to make one more point. The very first verse in Genesis 1 says, in the beginning when God created the heavens and the earth. And if you have a study Bible, you might see a footnote that offers an alternative translation to that first verse. And it goes like this: in the beginning when God began to create the heavens and the earth. There, maybe you don't see a big difference, but there is a difference. What's the difference between saying when God created versus when God began to create? I think there's a difference. The former suggests that it's in the past tense, that God created. The latter suggests what I think is more accurate, because of all of Genesis points to this, that God began to create and then continues to create, even to this very day. It's not just past tense. God is still creating. In the UCC, we love this phrase, God is still speaking. We say that a lot in the UCC, meaning God is still revealing truth to us, still speaking through us, through our interpretations of Scripture, through creation. God is still speaking. Well, Genesis 1 wants to say God is still creating. God is still creating. And I love what Asher O'Callaghan says, who's now a Christian minister, who's also transgender. He's quoted in Hartley's book. He's also quoted on the front of your bulletin. He reflects on Psalm 139 and says that God not only knit him together in his mother's womb, but continues to knit him together as he grows into adulthood. And he takes this theological truth from Genesis 1 that God is still creating him, and says God continues to create us, to knit us together, not just in the womb, but ongoing even through transitioning. God is still creating. Creation continues. It's not stagnant. All of creation wasn't already made by the time Genesis 1 ended. It was only beginning. And furthermore, God gives us then as human beings a task to play a part in creation, to give us power to make choices about our bodies, about who we are becoming, about living more fully into the image of God. Creation has to do not just with beginnings, but with the process of becoming. And I think God rejoices in this, in sharing this creation and creative process with us. I think God rejoices in the blue head wrasse. I think God delights in fruit-bearing trees. How amazing it is when a seed grows into a tree and bears fruit, and then within that fruit is another seed that has potential to create even more trees. I mean, that's exciting. I think God rejoices in that, and I think God rejoices when human beings can be their whole selves and live authentically as God is creating them to live. I think God rejoices when God sees us participating in creating life within ourselves, within community, and in our world. So let us today celebrate the mystery and magnificence of being created so colorfully and diverse as we are. And let us work for a world where all people can be welcomed and celebrated as image bearers of God. For the God we worship is truly a genderful God and truly an awesome God. Amen?
Amen.